What if the trees built up resistance and just stopped growing? Or the rivers formed a front line and just stopped flowing? There's no amount of intellect that justifies lack of respect. The power on this planet, man, it's time for us to redirect. What we take for granted to face and underhand, it won't get us to tomorrow for much more than you can stand.
Visiting has always been important to Indigenous peoples. Through visiting, we share stories, strengthen kinship, and learn from one another. It allows us to build and maintain respectful relationships in a way that uplifts Indigenous ways of being, doing, and knowing. I'm Matt Dunn, Senior Strategic Officer, Indigenous Engagement at the University of Saskatchewan. Today, we are honored to be meeting on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis, in the hopes of learning more about the research going on here, sharing stories, and honoring and appreciating our interconnectedness. Professor Deneh'Cho Thompson is a director, actor, playwright, coordinator of the wîcêhtowin theater program at the University of Saskatchewan, assistant professor in the drama department, and a member of the Wîcêhtowin Nation in the Northwest Territories. His research focuses on Indigenous acting techniques and approaches to teaching acting. Thanks for joining us. Well, really great to see you today, Deneh'Cho. How are you doing?
It's great. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Always happy to chat with you, chat about theater, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, excellent. So let's start by talking about your research. Can you tell me about your position at the University of Saskatchewan and the research that you do?
I am an assistant professor in the Department of Drama and the coordinator of the wîcêhtowin theater program, which is one of two Indigenous theater programs in a university in the country. We're the more practical focused of the two. It's an exciting program that I'm doing my best to grow and bring hopefully new teaching talent in over the next couple of years. And so as part of my own research, and I think ultimately why I'm here in this position, is I do a lot of research into Indigenous acting pedagogies. So how do we teach acting for Indigenous students, to Indigenous students, or from an Indigenous perspective? Which is really exciting to me because a lot of the theater training I received, one, didn't really mesh with my worldview. There was ideas like leave yourself at the door that didn't really work for me because I want to approach things from a holistic point of view. I want to bring my whole self. So I don't want to neglect a part of me. And I really think that a lot of our techniques in training actors in the majority of North American, Canadian for sure, theater training have the potential to do harm. They're not always operationalized that way, but there's a lot of exploration of trauma that's kind of inherent in acting. You know, you can't play someone who's grieving a loss without kind of understanding what it is to grieve a loss, but at the same time, there is a school of thought in the training world that you kind of let people steep in those kind of things in their own personal psychological way or relate to it. And I'm of the opinion that one, that does harm, but two, that does harm to people who have a higher instance of trauma in their life. For example, Canadian history dictates a higher instance of trauma for Indigenous people, right? And so it's important to recognize that different people have different experiences of trauma or anxiety or the symptoms that fall out of this history of trauma. And one of the acting sort of techniques or training methods that happens a lot is to push through or sit with or all of these things. But if, for example, student A has had a relatively safe and productive environment their entire lives, they probably find it easier to jump in and jump out of those kind of spaces. But if you've lived your whole life with housing insecurity, food insecurity, surrounded by addiction or mental illness, you have more experience of those things, but you might not be as safe exploring those things because you haven't had enough time away from them. You haven't been able to deal with them at a distance. And so it might be re-traumatizing to do a lot of this work. And so I think it's more exploring different pieces of yourself, things that for various reasons we've learned not to be comfortable showing other people, and how do we let those exist for a few moments, and even some of the darker things in ourselves, we kind of, like someone has to play the violent kidnapper in the violent kidnapping story. So how do they safely bring that dark little piece of themselves out, explore it, and then put it back and go, thank you, and go on with their day, right? I really want to create spaces where people don't have to feel harmed or do harm to themselves to feel like they're succeeding as an actor. And I feel like that's a lot of the experience I had in my own training. But I feel implored to be in a position here at the university to represent someone that I didn't have in my own academic career. An Indigenous person, a mentor, those kind of things. I didn't have someone that I related to during my career. And the relatively recent death of my younger brother, who was struggling with addiction and things like that, I've really felt the drive to make sure that there's fewer young Indigenous people that have the same experiences that we did, or feel that they don't fit in, or aren't allowed to be here. I think that's really unfortunate, and we need to create spaces where more and more Indigenous students are like, yeah, I want to be there. Wherever they want to be.
So you've been talking about acting in general, but I'm curious about what a Indigenous approach to acting is. Like, how is it different from a Western or Eurocentric approach?
Well, let's return to the idea of bringing your whole self, right? Me as an Indigenous person, I believe in a holistic balance of self that includes my mind, it includes my body, it includes my spirit, it includes my heart. And I use that as a framework for not only how I take care of myself, but how I interact with my family, with my community, and so on. And I think it talks to relational frameworks that I think a lot of Indigenous communities embrace, right? Like how am I in good relationship with people, or how am I trying to be in good relationship with people? Sometimes we aren't in good relation with people. And how does that create a better community as a whole? I think is another thing that is not often considered. How does my action of being in good relation with pieces of the community contribute to a larger community health? Which again, I think there's power structures in the theater sector that could benefit from that awareness of community health in a really important way. What we'll do today is we'll run through a sort of a warm-up, but in a framework that I think of a lot of my processes and practices through. So you're very familiar with the pan-Indigenous sort of medicine wheel, 4 directions kind of concept. For me, I think a little bit about it in sort of a framework of Indigenous holism. So we take care of our mind, our body, our spirit, our hearts. And so I do that through my acting work, I do that through my directing work, I do it in my theory, but I also do it as a way to think of warm-ups and things like that. So we're going to take care of our body, we're going to take care of our mind, take care of our heart, then we'll talk about spirit. And much like 4 directions, you'll notice 4 parts of your breath. There's the inhale, a pause, the exhale, and another little pause. You can start opening onto an open vowel, a sigh. It can be long, it can be short, it can be ha 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 ha. And as you're doing this, track where your body is touching the ground. Both in sort of Indigenous circles, we talk about our relationship to the ground, but in theater, we talk about grounded a lot too. We've started dealing with our bodies, right? So we're gonna deal with our minds a little bit. Let's make this red corner the corner of the space, to that green. Let's call it to this, just to close our space a little. You're just gonna start walking around the space. And then you're gonna start noticing things in the room. And just specifically, let the things that catch your attention or your eye draw your interest, right? And so you're just seeing them and just really seeing them. And notice if you're walking in a pattern, break that up. Listening is such an important part of acting. So this is, in a way, it's a practice of listening to the space around you. But also you start naming things and then you start naming them wrong. And so you're starting a pattern of both thinking, but allowing as well. And allowing is really, really important. From laughter all the way to sobbing is laughing and crying are actually physically very much the same. The thing that changes is the corners of your mouth. So if you start laughing again, say, and then as you get a good laugh going, turn into a frown. So get a good laugh going and then turn into a frown. And back up. Great. So that's kind of like a neat little trick of just like, you can tap right into something and change it. And it's fun. It's one way into what I would call the heart. One thing we do is called a tap out. And so you just, one hand goes out and you just start tapping, usually a loose cupped fist in our hand. You tap all the way up the arm, all the way down, and then you do your chest. I do clockwise circles. And then belly, obviously a little gentler because you got lots of tenders. And then you just kind of wash that energy out and your body goes, hey, I'm awake.
I feel great. Like I physically feel
I always
good.
feel like a little taller. And
Yeah,
like a little
spine and
broader.
all that. Yeah. Right on. Well, thank you, Deneh'Cho.
Well, thank you, Matt.
I'm curious then what some of those challenges are where you're pushing the limits on what the current norms are and trying to expand scholarship so that it is more inclusive of Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing.
For me, one of the biggest challenges is around sort of the lack or the need for Indigenous theatre scholarship. We have, in all publications of all time, there is one book, an anthology of several papers, that is all Indigenous practitioners or scholars edited by Indigenous practitioners and scholars. We have a single book. It's like, that's it. Our thinking is actually probably more aligned with Indigenous studies than it is in our own fields. And I think this is true for a lot of Indigenous academics, right? You're at the front and you're going, how do we make this Indigenous? And then you start reading and you're like, I don't know. And so you start working on it and you start doing some foundational work. And I guess that's the other part of that challenge for me, is knowing that myself and my colleagues are doing some things that are foundational for our field. It's really challenging to be confident in the work you're doing because you're living in an unknown and you're borrowing from other fields and all of that. So I think there's a challenge of sort of what I call dual proficiency. And again, most Indigenous academics experience this, is like, I have to be good at my field, and then I have to be good at least a portion of Indigenous theory.
Yeah, you have to have that additional skill set to really have that toolkit to fight those battles maybe that you need to.
Well, and validate your presence, right? Like that's really what it is.
If the university is able to hire more Indigenous faculty, especially in your department, what would you say to them if they're considering coming here to the University of Saskatchewan and Saskatoon?
I love it. I love the community. I love the food and culture scenes here. I love the university community. I think it's a really great place. I've found a lot of comfort being here. So move here to this place would be my first thing. Beyond that, I mean, I think the university is making some significant strides towards a better place for Indigenous people to be at. Universities are struggling with this, and it's a slow process, and we all know that, and it's very difficult conversations. But there is a lot of opportunity here, especially for a program as unique as this. We're the only practical Indigenous theatre program at a university in Canada.
So I'd like to take a step back from the research and talk more about your personal story. So tell me how you got into theatre, and more broadly, Indigenous theatre.
No, I grew up in Calgary, and I didn't actually think of theatre as something that I would do until very late in my high school career. In my final year of high school, I did a production of a Shakespeare play. I was in a production of a Shakespeare play, and I really enjoyed myself. It was pretty great. I was more into sports and athletics as a teenager than I was into the arts. And so I went and I did an international exchange, and I traveled around the country, and I lived in a couple of other cities. And one year I was home for Christmas, and some friends and I were hanging out, and I met someone that was doing a studio art degree in Vancouver. And they said, hey, we've got a theatre program. You seem like you're not really focused on anything in particular right now, and you said you love theater, so why don't you move out to Vancouver? And so I went and auditioned on a whim, and I got in, and I moved to Vancouver with a single backpack, and I kind of fell into the theater scene in Vancouver for better part of 15 years rather, better half. Yeah, so it's kind of like I love these moments. There's moments where everything is full of possibilities, but your path changes. And meeting that person at that party was that moment.
Yeah, took you down that whole other path. Can you speak to me about your academic, your artistic genealogy, and who do you draw inspiration from?
My family genealogy is where I'd like to start there. My grandfather, Phil Thompson, he was an Indigenous politician. He was part of the Air Force. He did a lot of great work. He was involved with the Friendship Center in Edmonton, one of the earliest kind of big initiatives there. And he's from up north, the Deneh'Cho region in the Northwest Territories. He grew up in the bush up there. I've also got a mixed Euro sort of family as well. But I grew up mostly in Treaty 6 in Métis territory, south of Edmonton, here.
So can you talk more about your lived experience as an urban First Nations person, as an urban Indigenous person, how that informs yourself and the work that you do?
The half-joking line that I use in these situations is I grew up on a mix of powwows and video games, right? So very, very young, I lived on reserve, not my reserve. My grandfather worked for a band council, Louisville Band Council, when I was really young, and we lived out there. And so I went to the native college as a baby, got passed around as people taught classes. It was totally a really, really in-community experience. I remember my first grand entry. I have a ribbon shirt that this big. I have all of that memory. But then when public school became something that needed to happen, we moved to the city to make it easier, and a lot of that fell away. And so it was sort of an implied experience for the greater part of my youth, right? It was I know I'm Indigenous, but there's nothing to indicate it in my daily life. And that was really complex, right? And because I was trying to fit in with the general population of my elementary school classes. I was trying to conform in some way to make my life easier instead of harder, and yet I could sense that my value systems differed a little bit from those same peers, right? And so I never felt like I was really from one place or the other, and it's this really I'm sure relatively common experience, but the not fitting in both directions, and being occasionally excluded from things by both sides, right? You're too Indian to hang out there, but you're not Indian enough to hang out there. So I was really lucky that in my university career, in my undergrad, I started exploring this notion, the permission to be an Indigenous artist instead of just an artist was a really big conversation for myself that I had over several years. And ultimately, one of my professors put me in contact with an Indigenous playwright. We had some conversations, and I went to a couple of events, and it was really in the professional world after my undergrad that I had the opportunity to see the diversity and strength of this really dynamic Indigenous arts community that gathered every year, and everyone knew each other, and there were long-lasting friendships, and there were beefs, and there was all of that, right? It was really fantastic to see that, but it took me this journey of not knowing where I fit in for the better part of my life, to come to this place where I knew that was where I was meant to be.
Well, this has been really wonderful. Thanks for your time, sharing it so freely, and just been really good chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you to the producing folks and all of that. And it's been a slice, as it were.
Yeah.